Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me here today. I'm very, very excited to be here. My name is Harpreet, and I'm an assistant professor of interaction and media design at Parsons School of Design. This is my first or second time talking to the CAA audience and in general to the design audience in China. So I'm very excited for this talk. I'm also very excited to introduce some of the ideas that we haven't really shown anywhere else. So thank you all for being here. Before we get started, I want to talk about, some of the background about myself and my own introduction. I'm an interaction designer by profession, and in terms of an interaction designer or a researcher, I have done a fair bit of things, and I'll talk about some of those right now. As I said, I'm currently an assistant professor at Parsons, the new school in New York City, and I've gone through a fair number of experiences of getting to my own definitions of interaction. And currently I'm at Parsons, but before that I was at Google and a bunch of other places such as the Media Lab and the Ars Electronica Future Lab, the National University of Singapore, as well as Microsoft Research in India and the US. So before we get started, I want to ask a question to all of you. What you see on your screen is an organism called Paramecium. And I want you all to try to figure out what is happening. Okay, so what you saw on your screen is called taxis. A taxis is the movement of an organism towards a stimuli. And in this case, the stimuli, as you saw, it's the change in the voltage. So when it's 0 volt or 0 milliamperes, nothing is happening. Paramecium is just floating around, nothing is happening. As soon as you start changing the voltage, paramecium starts going towards a certain terminal. Why is that happening? And that's the answer to this, and the definitions that extend from this is something that we are going to talk about today. So here's another one, a similar thing. This is also a taxis. These two rods are made of graphite. You are applying electric potential on one side, because of which these organisms, which are the same as the slime mold organisms, move towards one direction. And again, in this case, you will see if the direction of these potentials is changed, the organisms start to move towards a certain terminal. Why is that happening? I want you all to try to figure out what is happening in this case. Okay, so in this case, what you are seeing is actually called behavior, right? The behavior of an organism, which is the response to an input. And that's the word that we're going to stick around with today, and try to understand the definitions of what it means for an organism to have behavior, right? And if you use the same principles of these two rods, which are applying voltage, and then the organisms are attracted from one voltage to the other, it's the same thing that many of the other organisms do, but for many other senses. Let's look at another example, which is from Reading University, UK. This was done a few years ago. What these people did was...
You may think you have little in common with this robot, but it is controlled by living brain cells much like those inside your own head. Researchers grew a collection of around 300,000 rats.
So in this case, you know, we know that our own brains have neurons, and these neurons grow. We recycle these neurons in our own brain every day, and it's the same case with many of the organisms, including the rats. So what these researchers did was take these neurons and grew them in a petri dish. They take these chemically grown neurons, and after growing them, they separate them into motor neurons as well as sensory neurons. The sensory neurons, as you would expect, they can sense obstacles, they can sense, a bunch of other things. The motor neurons are the neurons that are triggered when there's supposed to be motion. So if I think about motion, my motor neurons will start to fire up. And it's the same case with the rat neurons as well. These researchers grew these neurons in a small petri dish and then started to connect electronic circuits with these neurons, because of which they were able to establish circuits that were able to work with the chemical signals of these rat neurons. Pretty amazing.
Brain cells in the lab. The cells quickly grow
As you can see here, this is the kind of circuit that they use to try to read what are the chemical signals that are inside these neurons. And then the robot
respond predictably to signals from the robot's ultrasound distance sensor. The output from these cells can be used to control the robot's motor circuits.
Again, this is not an electronic robot itself. This is the bioelectronic robot where the signals are coming from the rat neurons, the chemical signals from the neurons. And that's kind of the distinguishment that we want to draw today, or the kind of crux that we want to draw today from this lecture on how do we connect the biological world as well as the electronic world. As you see here, in terms of the sensory output, these researchers actually simulate that on a software. And once they simulate that, they try to see if the sensory neuron activates a motor neuron. If it does, then it stimulates the robot to go in different directions. Okay. Cool. So our next step is to actually look at this whole functionality. What you see on the screen right now, the sight, the hearing, taste, smell, touch, balance, temperature, all of these things have something in common. And these are obviously the senses, but they have something, a larger term in common, the term that we just defined, that is the word behavior. And I believe nothing captures the fundamentals of design more than the word behavior. Physiology, visuals, and other sensory stimuli are what we look at when we design. And that's, in my research, that's what we are focused on. I am more focused on how that dialogue happens already within nature, and how we could create new systems that could be potentially be in harmony with such responses. So if we go back to the sociological definitions of behavior, as you would notice, it's not just restricted to a person, it's restricted to, it includes an animal, and that means an organism as well. So in my latest work, I analyze plant and animal behavior to create design often for and with nature. Let's look at a few examples to understand what that means. So in this case, what you see in front of you, it's a plant connected with a computer. And this is kind of a very common experiment. And this is where my own research started as well. But I want to show how this work can extend our knowledge of technology, of what we are designing today, the possibilities and implications for the future as well. So what you see on your screen is what happens inside the plants. What are the kind of signals they produce when you touch them? This is a Mimosa pudica plant. When you touch this plant, it basically produces chemical signals inside. You can read those chemical signals, which is what's happening on your screen here. And what we know is these plants produce these signals. These specific plants produce these signals when you touch them. Venus flytrap produces it a different way, or or a different plant may produce it a different way. What we know already today is what happens inside the plants and the kind of signals they produce inside them, right? This is what we know for sure. However, dialogues arise when we do interaction design. Dialogues arise not only out of technology or nature alone, but it is a combination of them. And to show what it means for augmented nature, to try and understand how do we create a dialogue by using the signals inside plants, we started to create examples of what it means to have an augmented nature. And the first experiment that we did was called ILO1. In this case, as you see, we are doing the same thing as in the previous case, but in this case, we connect these plants with a robot. We take these chemical signals that you earlier saw previously coming from a Mimosa pudica. Now it comes from an anthurium plant. And you get these chemical signals and you send it to a robot. This is what we do in this case, right? And plants produce a lot of signals. They produce signals when they come in response to light, in response to change in gravity, change in soil conditions, water, etc., etc. So this is what we utilize in this case to try and talk about what it means to have, for technology to have a dialogue with nature, right? And in this case, we take two lights, we put them on either direction of the robot, and the robot just goes left and right by itself. Notice that this is a plant driving a robot and not the other way around. So this plant-robot hybrid was kind of my first work to talk about the vision of such things, of what it means to connect technology and plants together. What we know is plants produce these characteristic signals. How do we harness those signals? And similar to the examples of what you saw in the rat brain before, we try to understand the chemical signals inside the plants and connect them with our electronic circuits, right? And in terms of the future convergence that we are imagining of where our technology will start to talk with the plant world and the organic world, that's kind of what we are trying to showcase in this case by creating examples of that. So for us, as I said, in terms of the senses that you look at, the sensory stimuli is what we utilize. Then we have the word behavior. And then by understanding behavior and how our senses respond to what's happening in the environment, that's kind of how we do our own interaction design. But once we start to involve non-human species in this process, we kind of adopt the same process. We look at their sensory stimuli and how they respond, and then start to create technologies that can also do certain functions of what we actually do with our digital world as well. So I'll talk about the vision of this work later as well, but let's keep going with these examples in the future as well. What you just saw was one example of a robot, and with the research that we've been doing, we also created examples in botanic gardens. This was done at Tower Hill Botanic Gardens in Massachusetts to highlight the interplay between technology and nature. So it's not just one robot, it's actually many robots that were designed to be in conjunction with these plants, and we read these signals and drive these robots around in a botanical conservatory. So it's not just one plant, it's actually many plants. So I'll talk about this ahead as well. Let's keep going. There's a few projects that I want to show here. So one of these things is called Planta Digitalis, or phytoactuators. That's the next project that we are talking about. So what you previously saw was we were trying to read these signals from inside the plants, and that is, we are trying to listen to these signals. But in the next project, we are trying to send these signals to the plants, right? Previously, what you saw was more of an abstract vision and of machines and technology kind of co-evolving. But as an interaction designer, I'm also more interested in exploring the possibilities of everyday things. And in this project, we flipped the previous idea, So instead of listening to these signals, we are now sending the signals to the plant. And that's kind of, listening to sending is how we are creating that bi-directional communication between computer and the plants. That's what we envision as the starting or the beginning of interaction design. When you start to establish that connection with a digital interface, there are possibilities of creating dialogues with the technology and in being able to use these projects for different things, right? So let's look at
to not only listen to signals inside the plant, but also circuits that could send signals to them. We designed a live view software in which click.
So what you see here in this case is actually a software. This is a living plant, a Venus flytrap. And when you click on the software, what's happening is before we were able to listen and recognize the kind of signals that we understand. In this case, however, since we already know what are the kind of signals that plants produce when they close, we actually send these signals artificially by using a circuit. So when a person clicks in a software, it sends that signal to the plant, and then the plant automatically closes.
A corresponding signal. When a user clicks in the software, the corresponding leaf is closed, essentially turning the plant into a display.
Let's look at one more example of what happens. In the previous case, we saw we had the wires actually kind of
to not only
wires actually hanging outside. So you can see here's a wire and here's a wire. These are the wires that are receiving the signal when you click in a software. But the future, what we are talking about is convergence of technology and nature, right? And to be able to design interactive applications within nature. How do we pursue that, and how do we look forward to a vision maybe 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line? So this is one of the experiments that goes in that direction. So we took these plants, and what we do in this case is the stuff that you see here is actually a liquid polymer. This liquid polymer is actually called P-dot or Pro-dot, depending on what you're doing with it. This comes from the solar panel industry. We take this liquid polymer, it's kind of like liquid conductive material of some sort, but of a very specific molecular nature. We take these plants and we put it in P-dot for 24 to 48 hours, right? And what happens is we take these plants back under a microscope, we observe what happens. And what happens is we start to see a single nanowire inside a plant, inside the stem of a plant. So plants have something called xylem. Xylem is where the plants are absorbing water, and they are also absorbing all of the impurities with it. When you take a chemical which has a molecular structure that is smaller than the stem of a plant, you start to see, a small nanowire inside a plant. So this is kind of the beginning of convergence that we're talking about, of how the electronics of the outside will start to merge within nature. And when that merger happens, you start to do interactive applications with it by using the connection of digital world and the natural world. So let's keep going, and let's look at a further example as well. The previous example that you saw was actually inspired by a high school experiment, something as simple as taking a food dye and expressing it in water. What you just saw is not as simple as that, because you have to have control over the molecular structure for the molecular structure to polymerize inside the stem of a plant. And then what do you do with a plant which has electronics inside it? So because the future of sensing and interaction isn't going to be in the silicon world, it's going to be in the world around us. These are the kind of thought experiments that we are trying out. So with what happens when a plant has, a wire inside it, this is the kind of things that are possible. So what we did was we converted the plant into an antenna by growing a wire inside the stem of the plant. And you can see the plant is acting as an antenna is able to recognize the activities around it, as well as acting as a motion sensor, touch sensor, etc. So these are the interactive applications that become possible when you move the things inside the plant and still do the kind of digital functions that you do with a like a silicon chip, but instead that is happening from inside a plant. So let's shift the gears a little bit. I want to show you all another example of why we do this with a plant, right? So what is the reason that we do all of these things with the plants is because plants are self-powered, they are self-fabricating, they are self-repairing, self-regenerating. These are important, right? Why do we use the plants? And we could also use organisms, but plants are kind of a billion-year evolved organisms which have these really fantastic capabilities that actually we would like to use, right? And when you see these capabilities, when you see these capabilities, the self-powered, self-repairing, self-regenerating, and if you think about it, the artificial world doesn't do that. It doesn't grow, it doesn't repair, it doesn't regenerate. It's kind of a one-time use. What we want to do with the artificial world or the artificial electronics is to actually be organic, to not be harmful to our environment, to actually do the kind of things that organisms do. So the vision of using plants is to actually be able to design organic devices that can actually be self-powered, self-repairing, self-regenerating, and also just kind of disappear into the natural world. So that's why this work is about augmented nature, of what it means to actually do the same digital functions that we do with the digital world, but now within the natural world, with the added capacity that these functions, when they are over, they will just kind of disappear into nature and will not harm the environment. Another thing that I want to talk about, let's look at this experiment that I did a few years ago. So in this case, what's happening is these are carbon nanotube sensors. We'll look at them in further detail as well, but these carbon nanomaterials are nano in size. Basically, they are smaller than the cell of a plant, or sometimes a little bigger than the same cell of a plant. In this case, what we do is these materials or chemicals that we produce, they are able to recognize a specific element such as lead. Lead is toxic in the environment. It's found in old factories or even sometimes in industrial areas, and it's very harmful for our water, for example. So these chemicals that we produce, they are actually able to bind with lead and produce a very specific signal, right? In this case study, we made a heavy metal detector plants with carbon nanotube sensors that are injected inside the intracellular space of the plant, right? So you turn the leaf and you inject these sensors inside the plant, like you basically do a pressure injection. These sensors normally produce fluorescence, which is kind of a small glow when they come in contact, when they basically produce a normal fluorescence when nothing is happening. It's a small red glow, right? So we intentionally also use a normal house plant. This is called a peace lily, a spathipalum plant. It is used intentionally to show how such an augmented plant could be applicable at homes, and to try to show examples of what happens when our high-tech functionalities merge with the houseplants. What are the additional functionalities that we can get? So this is how we insert the nanotubes inside the plant. When you inject lead into the water, it takes 15 minutes to 2 hours for this lead injection to go and come up through the roots. When lead or any impurities comes up through the roots, it comes in contact with these sensors that we are injecting inside the leaves, and then the glow changes in the sense it will become dimmer or it will fade away, right? And what happens is you can just visually look at the plant and see if your water quality is okay or if it's better, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to go towards. So imagine these lead detecting plants in somewhere like Flint in Detroit, or somewhere in the US, where we need to monitor water quality constantly and give you a direct output. So this architecture of sensors is a general purpose platform. You can build these sensors of any kind to detect the pollution, but just kind of install them inside the plant. And that's the fantastic thing about them. These are kind of electricity free. They give you an output in real time, something that we cannot really do right now with even our artificial sensors, because we have to keep monitoring all the time, as well as when we do take a sample, we have to send it to a lab and it takes a long time. These sensors can work within the context of 15 minutes to 2 hours, electricity free, 24 hours a day. So let's look at a little bit, how these sensors work. So as you can see, when you inject lead into the plant, the lead comes up through the leaves, it quenches the glow. And when you see that happening visually, that's your indicator of saying there is something in the environment that is not working. So similar thing here, we take lead and we inject that inside the root system. It probably takes around 2 hours for that to happen. And the sensors are just designed this way that when they come in contact with these nanomaterials and impurities, they produce fluorescence quenching, which is the visual glow that you were seeing before just disappears. And when it disappears, that means there is something harmful in the environment. So that's the kind of thing that we were working towards. And in saying that, like these applications are not the only ones that we are restricted towards. We design applications in all sorts of areas. So one of the applications that I want to show you right now is an application in bioarchitecture. So here's an example of a self-growing, self-repairing architecture. This is in India that has lasted for more than 1,000 years, I believe. So concrete structures obviously cannot do this because they degrade over the years, but this architecture kind of repairs itself. And this was grown by the locals with banyan trees on either side of a river. And the locals kind of just took the aerial roots and then just kind of stitched them together, and it becomes a bridge, right? And over the years, it has lasted. People walk over it, and it's not going to die as soon as, let's say, a concrete bridge. What we wanted to do was to use this as kind of motivation to automate this process, to show that we can actually use plants for even growing without human intervention. So what we started designing was these robots that live on the stem of a plant. They have these lights that are mounted, and this light is obviously stimulating the growth of the plant in a very specific direction. So what we're trying to do here is to show that we can stimulate the growth of a plant in a very specific direction to try to design architecture or furniture for the future. It's a very small experiment right now. Obviously, we are doing it with sunflower because we want to get the results within 40 days or something. But eventually, we would like this to be outdoors in a forest with bamboo, where we can start to design, for example, the architectural framework of a building. So in this case, this is a 60-day experiment. We take these robots, we put them on the stem of a plant. And when we do that, these plants start to move towards the light. We also know that the sunflower plants, they they grow by 4 inches per week. And when that happens, the robot goes up by 4 inches per week and keeps stimulating the growth of the sunflower and guiding its direction. Imagine growing such structures where you leave these robots for a long duration and they are finally able to grow into furniture or architectural frameworks, right? And that's the kind of vision that we want to go towards. And as I said, this was a 60 or 45-day experiment to get different growth trajectories, and this is how the output looks like. So essentially what we do is, in a software, we pre-program the kind of growth trajectories that we need. The robot is controlled by the software to try to grow the plants in a very specific direction. And the lights go on and off to do that over a period of 45 days. And then after 45 days, we get a very specific kind of shape. Again, we don't have full control because nature is disobedient and it works in a very specific way. But the combination of what we are doing with the robots, with the nature's own growth mechanism, is the kind of organic growth that we get right now. And the outdoor experiments obviously will be different. It won't be done with light. It probably will be done with stress and all of that. So here's what it looks like. As you can see, this is kind of the simulation with with the software itself. The lights go on and off, and when that happens, we do that in the real world as well. When the robot is on the plant, and over a period of 60 days, it starts to kind of morph in a certain direction and starts to bend towards a certain direction, and then we start to design longer structures with it. The future is what you look at. This is where we want to go with this technology. Imagine leaving these robots in a forest where they kind of grow into very weird shapes or organic shapes as the architectural framework of building automatically without human intervention. So tree shaping in general has been around for a long time. What we are doing is kind of just automating that process where plants can grow into specific shapes. And we also do that with gravity. For example, like the plants, they grow, if you put them like this, they will start to grow like this. And when you tilt them, they will start to grow like this. So we try to use that mechanism to see what is the kind of growth that we can program in these plants by using software, right? So we've done all sorts of experiments in that regard. But right now, let's shift the gears a little bit. I want to show you something even more futuristic. When we design these experiments, and many of you might have a question, how do we look at, to design these experiments? When we look at the process of designing hybrids or futuristic things where things are being merged with the plant functionalities, we not only have to look at what's happening inside the plant, we also have to look at the evolutionary timeline of where the plants come from. So we also study the rudimentary plant processes, right? And in this case, to design hybrids, we also study evolution. So one of the experiments that we recently did was to try and study why do leaves or the shape of plants look like the way they do. And how are these shapes? How did these shapes come about to be the kind of shapes that they are? So we try to replicate conditions of early evolution, conditions of silent space within, like a zero gravity experiment. What we did was we basically designed a payload that actually is that goes inside a rocket. So here's what the rocket looks like. This is not designed by us. This company called Blue Origin allows you to rent space within a rocket. You basically design a payload, you put it inside this rocket, and we designed an experiment that goes up in space and remains in the zero gravity for approximately 3 minutes. And because it remains in space for 3 minutes, we try to replicate conditions of early evolution, zero gravity. And we try to figure out, like, why are the shapes of plants the way they look like, and when we do that, we send these plants into the space, and this is kind of what the outputs look like. This is how the crystals start growing. We did this experiment obviously with inorganic materials such as silver in this case, and as you can see, this is the kind of output that we get in space. So this is kind of what we are getting in terms of the structure. And as you see, this is an inorganic material, but looks very natural. And this is kind of how plants or trees are shaped as well. And that's what we were trying to study. The results are still under consideration. These are the kind of things that we are pursuing right now as well. And one of the other experiments that we did in 0G is just last month, where we took this plant's tissue in a zero gravity flight to understand what are the signals that are happening inside the plants in zero gravity. But what we are trying to establish is a closed loop between our technologies that can understand nature better and the opposite way as well. So for most of these technologies at the level of fundamental research, the face or possibilities might be different. But through the research, what we are probing is where we can get to eventually by asking these questions, right? And this is me, and this is research. We are still analyzing these results, and this is kind of what the mechanism looked like. So for people who would be interested in, very design-like applications or very present applications, there's something that I want to show. This was during my time at Google, where, I was interested in showing interactive applications, but not with just a phone. What we do is we look at our phones, we look at the weather, and the weather says 32 degrees or whatever. Right. This is not very natural. This is not what we do when we go out into the natural world. We can just look at the clouds. We can look at things around us, and that's the kind of ambient information that we're getting. And that ambient information is just kind of a natural interaction. That is what's natural, right? Sitting on a computer is not natural. What is natural is to just kind of go outside and look at the weather and do this sort of thing. So I was exploring. We have these voice assistants right now, and these voice assistants do certain things, but I was looking at how do we take these voice assistants and kind of, start to have a natural conversation with them in the sense, the way we have it in the natural world outside. Again, this is meant for places such as New York City, where it might be inside in an apartment, for example, right? So in this case, we designed, or, when I was at Google, I took this project upon myself where I designed this terrarium and connected this to Google Home, and basically.
This is Project Oasis, a voice control terrarium.
So there's a few things that are happening inside this terrarium. You are basically getting light, control of lighting, control of clouds, control of rain, but inside a small box. It's a closed loop terrarium. And then you can start to do things that would be a little more natural than what you would do, by looking at your phone and trying to figure out what the weather is.
Box. We live in between nature and technology, and we usually look at them as two very different worlds. Project Oasis brings these worlds together and lets you interact with them by using your voice. It's a self-sufficient closed ecosystem that can mimic sunlight, rain, and clouds.
What's the weather like in Hanoi?
Reported.
Cloudy.
Oh, it's
And
raining.
rain.
Weather in San Francisco.
Reported.
Project Oasis was made with Google's tools, Dialogflow and Cloud PubSub. This is just a simple experiment to expand a conversation with nature and technology. You can build your own terrarium by visiting the following link.
Okay, so Let's see if I'm missing something here. Seems good. I want to show you all another very cool project that one of my students was pursuing recently. This is a student, Yating Wu, who was at Parsons MFA DT in the class of 2020. We had this class at Parsons that I was running called Design in Safaris, and I designed this new class where behavior scientists, animal experts come to the class. They speak about animal behaviors, and they talk to these designers or anthropologists who are sitting in the class. So in this class, we have anthropologists, designers, architecture students, and many other disciplines kind of sitting together. And then they talk to these animal experts about how animals interact with objects. And at the end of the class, we selected a few students and sent them to the San Diego Zoo, who was our collaborator with the class. And we asked 3 students to design projects, that were not just for a person, but actually for animals. And for that to happen, obviously, we go back to the same thing. We go back to our sight, sensory stimuli, the behavior, analyzing the behavior, the way we respond to an input. And then by looking at that, we are able to design interactive objects that are also for animals. So Yating designed this box, which was for an elephant. This elephant basically, she found through research that elephants have an affinity to certain kinds of sounds or music. And the purpose of the project was to give more choice and control to elephants, especially within the context of a zoo. So she designed this object where she took a box and then, she put it in front of an elephant, and the elephant was like, I don't care. But then what she did was she put this small music inside, a certain kind of music inside this box, and the elephant was interested, and then it interacted with it for maybe 6 seconds. But then what happened was she took this box and then took different textures on each face of the box. On each face of the box, she also mapped a different music, right? So the elephant, this is because she knew of the behavior of the elephant, on how elephants interact and what are their affinities, what do they respond to. She knew about this because of her study of behavior, right? So when she did that, the elephant was very curious, and it tried to rotate this box and try to do all these interactive things. And that's because there are different things that happen on rotating this box. So the elephant got super curious and then kept on interacting with it for 2 hours. And the animal keeper said, that generally doesn't happen because, it's not a thing that elephants would normally interact with. But with a careful study of behavior, that's the kind of things that you can start to design. So let's look at this project a little bit, short. So here's what the elephant does. There are different textures on each face of this cube, and it's playing certain sounds it likes. It keeps doing that for quite a while. This is pretty amazing to have that level of understanding of bird behavior and to design interactive objects with it for non-human species. That's what we were going for. So this project, in my view, was the most successful project that came out of the class, and was also just in general a very good case study of how to design interactive objects that are not just meant for humans, right? So with that said, I want to also quickly get to the point where we may have some time for question and answers as well. I want to emphasize, why are we doing all of these things? We think of nature and we think of evolution, but let's look at culture. What is culture? Culture is the sum of artifacts that is produced by a group of individuals, like inhabitants of a state, inhabitants of a nation. While nature tends to be connected to the cause and effect, the evolution culture is bound to the deliberate action, the revolution, right? Our technological culture and the things that we're designing is for all of us. It should not be kept to a select few, and it hopefully extends to non-human species as well. Whether it be a robot that is designed for a plant or interactive objects that are designed for animals, all of those things are part of our technological cultures. And that's what we are pursuing in my research here in design for non-human species, right? I want to open it up to everyone here for questions, but thank you all for inviting me. If you are all trying to reach me, I'll write that email here as well. And this work is happening at the Design and Technology program at Parsons School of Design. I congratulate you all for living through this time and, in being able to pursue your studies further as well. So this work, as you saw, it's the convergence of organic as well as the artificial world. That's what we call as the bionic world. So we design not only for us, we design for plants, we design for animals. Sometimes we design for us by using, some organic devices as well. So all of this is something that we are pursuing in my research. But in general, this is the kind of direction that we are taking right now. You are all welcome to ask any questions. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I was very honored and excited when I heard about this lecture series. I have heard a few good things about the previous speakers as well. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to answer the questions for all of you. Thank you all for listening attentively. Thank you all for being here. And feel free to send me an email if you have questions as well. But I will be answering them live right now as well.